Thanks for staying with us here on Live Now from Fox. I'm your host, Christina Evans. As promised, we're going to be talking about Luigi Mangione. I want to show you that live shot that we have there in the Big Apple. All of our focus is going to be there as it pertains to this case because he's set to appear before a New York judge tomorrow. Mangione is accused of shooting and killing United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson outside of a Midtown hotel back in December. There was a manhunt that ensued for several days after before he was finally captured in a neighboring state. We do know that Luigi Mangione's attorneys have been setting up websites to share information about his different cases, and it's also bringing questions about his potential legal and defense strategy as well, as you can see with this post there from the Baltimore Sun. To discuss more about what's set to happen in court tomorrow, I want to bring in legal analyst Jeremy Rosenthal. Jeremy, thanks so much for being with us this evening on Live Now from Fox. Again, let's start with the very basics. We know that Luigi Mangione is expected to be in court tomorrow. His appearance is scheduled for 2:15 p.m. Eastern Time. What is expected to happen there in the courtroom?
Tomorrow in New York State, he's expected to have a pretrial, and a pretrial is going to be sort of a preliminary type event. They're going to be scheduling a trial date. Hopefully we'll get a trial date in the case. There's also going to be some deadlines. There's a lot of what you call discovery in a case like this. That's going to be information that the prosecution has to hand over to Mr. Mangione and his defense team. There's a lot of search warrants. There's a lot of forensic evidence. There's a lot of camera footage from different angles and surveillance. So there's a whole lot of things that have to be given over to Mr. Mangione and his defense team. And we can expect a timeline for all of those things. Also, if Luigi Mangione is going to assert an insanity defense, he's probably going to have a timeline where he has to announce that and let the prosecution know. So I think we're going to get a lot more clarity on how this is going to look going forward tomorrow.
I'm so glad you mentioned that because so many folks are interested in this case as we're showing some of this video. He hasn't been seen in court since the day where he was wearing this maroon sweater. This was his first time. That was for his original arraignment charges. He did end up pleading not guilty to murder charges that included an enhancement for terrorism as well. So when we're in the courtroom and we're listening in to the courtroom tomorrow and Luigi's there, you said this is the time for the defense to first, if they're going to bring up the argument of insanity, why is this the time to do that? Can you explain how this case has to move forward as far as the legal hurdles that have to be captured first?
That's a great question, Christina. So think of it like this. If we're defending a case in court, we never really have to give notice to the prosecution of how we're going to do it. Remember, the prosecution always has the burden of proof. They have to prove a case anywhere in the United States beyond a reasonable doubt. But in certain instances, if you are going to assert a defense, such as an insanity plea, that's going to involve a lot of expert witnesses. And if you're going to, so it's not fair necessarily to the prosecution for you to be armed with 2 or 3 or 4 high-profile expert witnesses that you can just throw up on the jury, on the witness stand in front of the jury. So the prosecution does get a little bit of time to do their own evaluations, to have their own experts sort of take a look at that, because we're really going to start doing a deep dive into Mr. Mangione's psychology if he does assert that insanity defense. Doesn't have to do it tomorrow, but he'll have a timeline where he does have to do that and a deadline where he'll have to do that. In all certainty, once we get that trial date, because it's retroactive and it moves backwards.
I'm glad you mentioned that. So let's talk about the defense fund. The legal defense fund, as we know, online has surpassed its original goal of $50,000 in December. It was first posted on December 10th of last year. The new amount, though, was set for $1 million. Let's talk about the amount. Why is this set at $1 million? It seems like a lot of money. I know he's facing these heavy charges, but can you sort of explain what that money would go towards?
A case like this, he's facing in New York State life in prison. He's facing the death penalty in federal court, and death penalty cases are massively expensive. The vast majority of time, the state, regardless of what state is seeking the death penalty, picks up the tab for that, and that can run into the millions of dollars. because we're talking about multiple expert witnesses, psychologists, psychiatrists, both for the state and for the defense. And you're also talking potentially about multiple trials, multiple appeals. When we see these death penalty cases, they yo-yo back and forth from state court to federal court to the Supreme Court. We get all these stays of execution at the last minute. So they are massively expensive. And if you can do it privately, then you can go and sort of pick who you want to have run your legal defense. And also, you can really pick a lot of the top-notch experts that are out there. Not that the ones that handle this on a regular basis are bad. They're certainly not. But you really do have a lot more latitude than your average criminal defendant who's facing a death penalty.
And let's talk about, we've heard from Luigi Mangione for the first time this week as well on that website where they've been raising all of this money. This has essentially been crowdsourced to fund his legal defense. And he also released his first statement. I do want to read a portion of it. It says, quote, "I am overwhelmed by and grateful for everyone who has written me to share their stories and express their support." That was part of that statement, as you can see there on your screen. But he's also saying that powerfully, this support has transcended political, racial, and even class divisions as the mail has flooded in D.C. from around the country, around the globe. While it is impossible for me to reply to most letters, please know that I read every one I receive. Thank you again to everyone who took the time to write. I look forward to hearing more in the future. It's just such an interesting dichotomy with this case, with all of these folks from around the country, maybe even from around the world, supporting Luigi Mangione, even though they don't know him personally at all. This is just an interesting angle to this case.
He's certainly taken on a cult hero status, if you will, which is very ironic because he comes from kind of what you would consider to be a privileged background. Whereas the victim in this case, Brian Thompson, the United Healthcare CEO, actually was sort of a bootstrap story. He's a guy from a small town in Iowa. So he's not necessarily what you would think as the prototype CEO, but yet he has certainly developed a cult following, so much so that I've listened to experts that are kind of almost concerned about it. I heard one statistic that said roughly 40% of people to some degree sympathize with Mr. Mangione. Now, I also understand that 78% of all statistics are made up on the spot. So we can't necessarily trust statistics like that. But I mean, the proof's in the pudding. He raised all this money for his legal defense, and he's caught almost red-handed, or potentially, I mean, you can even say red-handed, committing murder on the streets of New York, and he has this level of support. So it shows that there's a certain level of at least dissatisfaction, maybe with the insurance industry, and it shows some lying anger or mistrust amongst the people who are supporting him. So you're absolutely correct, Christina. I mean, it's kind of weird.
And even more, you mentioned this briefly earlier as we were talking sort of about what his defense angle can be. I want to put up this shot that we have there of the White House. So what changed things in this case in the last month? We do know that Trump, once he got in office on January 20th, ordered the Attorney General to pursue the death penalty for all crimes of severity demanding its use. This action ended a moratorium on federal executions that was enacted by former President Joe Biden's administration. So you've talked a bit about the insanity, potential defense. What else, now that this, again, death penalty is in play, could the defense use as an angle to try to avoid a conviction there, as he's already pleaded not guilty, Luigi Mangione?
Right. He certainly used it to raise funds. Some of the donations that he's had have actually acknowledged or referenced President Trump's executive order. Right. And you had a dramatic reversal. President Biden in his last days commuted the sentences of, I believe, 39 death row inmates on federal death row. So a dramatic reversal of that. Now, he didn't specifically mention Luigi Mangione in his executive order, and it's largely a symbolic one, although he did sort of acknowledge that we're going to turn the faucet on here at the federal level for death penalty cases. Mangione has certainly capitalized that on that, at least for fundraising. Now, the one thing I would say is that the statement released by Luigi Mangione, if I'm trying to prove up an insanity defense, that doesn't sound very insane to me. Now, I would bet anything that any message coming from Luigi Mangione is highly curated by his attorneys, that comes out of the jail and goes to the public like that. So, and maybe later on they may tell us, well, no, that was our PR team that wrote that. But it's going to kind of be hard to deny that that came from him. Sounds like a pretty coherent, cognizant person. Maybe he's medicated at this point. Maybe that's made a difference. But again, very fascinating things we simply don't see in your run of the mill case.
And it's been a case that's been capturing the nation's attention, of course, worldwide as well. We've been hearing a lot about it. So let's talk about the different charges that he has and the location. So we know that he's facing state charges in New York and Pennsylvania, as well as federal charges. How do all of these three cases that where he's facing these charges move together, and how are they separate?
Right. So the you would expect New York State to really sort of take the lead here, and that appears to be what's happening. He's almost certainly going to get the first trial setting in New York State, and there he's facing a life sentence there. I think what happens in this case is that whatever happens in New York State, the rest will sort of follow suit. If he gets a life sentence or a really big sentence in New York State, then I don't know that the feds necessarily try to convict him for a death sentence. Although we see people all the time that go through multiple trials and they're convicted multiple times. Harvey Weinstein, a good example. Just because on a public case, just because one uh, uh, jurisdiction convicts him doesn't mean the other one's not going to go get their pound of flesh too. The state of Pennsylvania has some comparatively minor charges, their weapons charges, their document falsification charges. So you would expect them to kind of lay sort of back and really take third chair here. But what will be interesting will be the executive order about the death penalty and to see whether or not, regardless of what happens in New York State, what the feds do here. That will be, to me, the really fascinating part of this.
And after this, we know that he's set to make his next appearance there in federal court March 19th. Also, he's scheduled right now to appear in court on February 24th, I should say, in Pennsylvania as well. So all interesting dates that are lining up here. Again, I have to ask you, do you have any final thoughts before I let you go, Jeremy?
I think we're going to get a lot more clarity tomorrow on this, but this is definitely going to be a fascinating story going forward. You've got kind of, again, this cult figure who, in some ways, a lot of people find charismatic. That doesn't mean you win. I mean, Ted Bundy had all of these things as well. A very handsome, very sharp individual who was a brutal killer and was ultimately executed. And I'm not suggesting that Mangione's crimes were as pervasive or severe as somebody like Ted Bundy. I mean, murder is murder, but at the same time, it will just be interesting to see the twists and the turns and how this plays out. And will there be a big push for what you might call jury nullification? In other words, we like you so much, Luigi Mangione, that we're going to acquit you, or we feel like what you did was so justified that we're going to acquit you. If a jury gets to that point, that'll be pretty fascinating, I think.
It certainly will, and we'll certainly continue to keep our eyes on this case. I do want to say I appreciate you, legal analyst Jeremy Rosenthal, for joining us here, previewing Luigi Mangione, set to be in court on Friday. Thanks so much for being with us here on Live Now.
Have a good night, Christina.